My name is Matthias Harder. I'm the curator and director of the Helmut Newton Foundation. We see here the show Sumo, Three Boys from Pasadena, and Private Photo Collection of Helmut and June. So a legendary photo book in a huge format, private photo collection, and three former assistants of Helmut Newton are the ingredients of this exhibition at the Helmut Newton Foundation. We are here in the first room and see photographs of just Loomis, who's living in Los Angeles since a couple of years and actually born in Reno in Nevada, but he came there to LA and he works there as a freelance photographer. Ten years ago, we had a show with the three boys from Pasadena. The three boys were exhibited in one big room. Now we decided 10 years later to combine this show with Helmut's Sumo and give all the three photographers did their own work in the meantime, of course, each one room, one exhibition room, and put between the two walls in the center of the room the older work and present the most recent work around it. So we have on the huge walls the new prints produced by the three photographers, in this case by just Loomis. And we see here a big series he did backstage. And this is as well the title of his show, Backstage. And we see the photographs of models and behind the scenes, more or less, of fashion shows in Paris, Milan, in Los Angeles, in New York, and several other places from the 1980s, in the 1990s, and later on. So between the two walls are the earlier photographs before exhibited in our former exhibition in the year 2009. These are very empathetic narrations, let's say, of the people he met in different places. So be it children or waitresses or people on the beaches in LA and Malibu. There's as well a vitrine in each of the three rooms, streetwise, and every of the three photographers is using it completely different. So just replaces the plexiglass hub of the vitrine in this case, and then just uses the vitrine as a flat table-like presentation for some enlarged contact sheets are showing Helmut at work. So he, as a former assistant of Helmut Newton, was with him over the years and decades. So what we can see here is a look back into the 80s, 90s, and the zeros, the last photographs, in the collaboration of Helmut Newton and Loomis. As we can see here on the walls, he did his own work, parallel and afterwards. Helmut died in the year 2004, and they met several times in LA especially. Newton had some more assistants, but these three assistants, formerly students from Pasadena, therefore the title just in brackets, the three boys from Pasadena, were former art students at the Pasadena Art School. What we see here with Loomis prints is he was just using the full-size photographs he took backstage in black and white and color over the years, and just add these photographs without any distance to each other directly onto the wall, which is a very unusual presentation. Attracted a lot of people in that show. It's kind of a freeze, and it's like a film scene. It's going from one to the other, a breathless journey into this kind of fashion. But we see as well the concentration and the fun behind the scene. We don't see actually any scenes at the stage, but what we see here is the life of the models besides all this glitzy fashion business. Every of the three rooms are very individual. We are now entering the second room dedicated to Mark Arbeit, one of the three former assistants of Helmut Newton. So what you see here, life-size photographs. So it's a kind of a homage to Helmut Newton's big nudes. So we see these life-size nudes he put directly onto the photo paper as a photogram was made in a workshop in former years. So the idea is the same here. So we have in the center, the core of the rooms, the former work, and surrounded by the later ones. So works which has actually nothing to do with the assistantship of for Helmut. So, but sometimes it's a dedication to him. So we see sometimes two nudes laying on the photogram, life size, just one nude laying down and with some lines and so on in the background. So it's an abstract and concrete work in one. And then we see the smaller ones. And of course, these photograms are not made by real people, but with dolls. So this is a kind of an homage to Helmut Newton's collection, his own collection, because he was collecting little puppets, so dolls. Mark Arbeit organized some of these dolls for himself and was working with these kind of dolls in his photogram work. Between the two extra walls, we see the former work we exhibited in 2009. It was similar to the room of Loomis, of course, and we will see it again in the case of the individual room of George Holtz. So what we see here with Mark Arbeit is we have tiny little framed Polaroids he was working on. So we have a kind of a blurred photography with female nudes And in the center, the vitrine, we have a kind of a series he did in artist studios in Paris. So we can imagine that an artist, a sculptor or a painter was working with these nudes Mark Arbeit added into these studios was working before. So this is the kind of an idea, an homage to the art in general. In the vitrine, we see some memorabilia, which was similarly exhibited in the former exhibition. So this has something to do with the assistantship of Helmut Newton and Mark Arbeit. So we see some work prints and photographs Mark Arbeit took of Helmut Newton during the common shootings and so on. So this is the former work, more or less, between the walls. And then we go on with a new series he did in the year 2006. This is dedicated to Newton and to another great American photographer, Irving Penn. We see torsos, and Mark Arbeit was also assisting later on Irving Penn, and these torsos were shot a little later. Mark Arbeit, George Loomis and George Holtz were very close friends of June Newton as well. So they met time and again in Los Angeles when June came to the Chateau Marmont, where Helmut and June lived from 1981 onwards. After 2004, June came there alone. A little later, Mark Arbeit met June there for a dinner. He showed her this new series of the torsos. She was very excited about that. So he went on with the series. And this is a great thing that we can exhibit these works now with the two other assistants at the Helmut Newton Foundation. So Mark was doing it, let's say, similar to the antiquity, or let's say to the surrealistic movement. He was just covering heads, hands, and the legs with a cloth, the black cloth, and then just realizing the torso series, the nude torso series. Sometimes these women are very thin, sometimes are not so thin. It's a little bit different from the style he was using as well with the other models. For that. If you go a little closer to these huge prints of the models, more or less life size or even bigger, then you see that the flesh and the skin becomes a kind of a marble. So then you're very close to the idea of the sculptures and to the reference to antiquity. The third room is dedicated to George Holtz and his photography. We see here, similar to Helmut Newton, all the three genres. It's fashion photography, portrait photography, and nude photography. And sometimes we see the same people in his prints. And we see Madonna, for example, or Jack Nicholson and several others. So as well photographed by Helmut Newton. This is interesting to see how the assistantship of Judge Holtz he did with Helmut helped him to open some doors for himself to photograph as well others. Several of these celebrity photographs were published on covers and within the magazines. And you can see here the juxtaposition of the portrait and the nude in this water. And on the other side, the walls, you see it vice versa, that you have the nudes and the portrait. Between the walls, again here, it's the former work he was exhibiting at the Helmut Newton Foundation 10 years earlier, as the three of them were shown and displayed in a different room at the foundation. So we see the nudes here, the earlier ones. He did plein air outside. We see the portraits are shot in black and white and color. This is similar with Helmut for the magazines, and sometimes he was commissioned by the magazines to do black and white photographs or color ones. So George Holtz is doing more or less the same way. So we have this idea 10 years later, and we see the new stuff they did in the meantime. So everybody becomes his own photographer. And now the three of them are more or less in the same age as Helmut was, as they were assisting him. And here in the vitrine, for example, are many, many objects, memorabilia, including a little cup from the Café Einstein, where the two of them were always having a cup of coffee, or the Hotel Bogota, the key where George Holtz were photographing several people, and Helmut did his apprenticeship with Eva in the 30s. So there are a lot of close circles here within the exhibition. And these two walls in between, including the vitrine, the memorabilia, which we had before 10 years ago, are surrounded by the newer work, by these portraits he did later on. You see at the last wall the nudes. It's small prints. Sometimes it's life-size or more than life-size. You see the portraits, and then you see here at the last wall. Sometimes as well the same models, like Sylvia Goebel, which was photographed by Helmut Newton before. So sometimes it becomes full circle seeing as well, looking at the models and looking at the people they photographed even later. And then if you turn around and then opposite this nude wall, you see the later president of the USA. By then, he was just a businessman with his new girlfriend photographed in the Trump Tower, but there's a little mistake as well with the flag, which is directly onto the ground. But this is another story. As Helmut did many publications of his own work, also these three boys from Pasadena, Mark Arbeit, Just Loomis, and George Halls, are doing books from time to time. And the publication on Backstage, for example, by Just Loomis was launched at the Helmut Newton Foundation before his prints came onto the wall. We have a tiny little publication for the torso series of Mark Arbeit, and we are going to produce a book on George Hall's nude photographs later on. So this is in planning, and so if you do the photographs and publish it in magazines, which is actually the first idea, the first commission for, then there's of course a second idea to bring it onto the wall in exhibitions like these, to put it into books, which we are still will be doing as well in the future. So this is a good distribution of works of photography, portrait, nude, and fashion photography, of course. If you go out to the lobby of the Helmut Newton Foundation and go on to the other side, we are confronted with the 5 big nudes. This was a former military casino, and Helmut Newton was presented this building for his foundation in the year 2003. So he said, all right, this is the place for my foundation. So we have a public-private partnership with the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, where you see the 5 big nudes were before 5 Prussian officials. And this is quite funny because now we have this kind of change of paradigm. Now the 5 women, Newton's models, take over the building, take over the power within the building. Opposite these 5 famous works from 1981, the famous diptych of Sie kommen, they are coming. This is diptych which was published in French Vogue. You see the 4 models dressed and undressed. This marks the idea of the Naked and Dressed series, which he started around that time and which caused a scandal as it was published in French Vogue. But later on he decided to print these 2 motifs life-size. And the idea of to print photographs life-size was radical, was a great idea Helmut had in these years directly afterwards. So we're speaking about vintage prints here. So he had a lot of people supporting him. For example, Klaus Honnef, who was exhibiting these big nudes as well, others. around that time, around 1980. This happened in Bonn, in Germany. So this was more or less the kickstart for his nude photography. And later on, the book Big Nudes came onto the market. This created a new idea in his work. So the common, they are coming, including the series Naked and Dressed, marked, let's say, the shift from fashion to nude photography by then. The idea to distribute his photographic ideas through books was actually made in 1976. This idea, there was his first book called White Women coming onto the market. This was the Newton version of some shootings he did for fashion customers, editorial work. Just 2 years later, there was a second book called Sleepless Nights. This was actually material he was photographing before for magazines and then just reprinting in book form. 81, there was Big Nudes, a very, very famous and great book he brought onto the market, like the others, in several editions. And there were following so many other publications. We're entering now the exhibition Helmut Newton Sumo. And this is a very special book, a huge book, a book which came onto the market in an edition of 10,000 copies, all signed by the photographer. It's a really huge format. No publisher, no photographer dared to do a book in this size. It was expensive coming onto the market, of course. It came with its own stand designed by Philip Stark. The weight is 30 kilos and it has 400 pages in the size of 70 by 50 centimeters. What we did in this exhibition for the first time 10 years ago, together with the three boys of Pasadena, and now again, 2019, as the new edition came out, the 20-year anniversary edition in a smaller format, what we did here again is to bring all the framed pages onto the wall. The book starts with a little text he did. He wrote in English, and then it starts with some photographs, with early photographs from the 60s. Actually, he started photography in the 30s, as you know. Later on, working in Australia in the 40s, and for British Vogue in the 50s, and so on. But actually, his work starts with the year 61 as he entered French Vogue magazine. And you see a lot of these works, these early works from the 60s, in the first pages of this book. The difference between flipping through the pages of a book and going into an exhibition like this is, of course, that you don't see just two pages in front of you, flipping through the pages of the book, but you see all the works at once. You go on a kind of a journey with your own eyes into the book, and you see everything at the same time, and you decide how to read, if you read from left to right, line by line, or if you go from up and down and from left to right and so on. So in these extra walls, we just add 2 rows. In the bigger walls, we just hang 3 rows of pictures. And we were filling up all the big rooms and the back room, the main room and the back room at the Helmut Newton Foundation with all of his works. The printed page was always his dynamo, as he said. So this was the printed page in a double sense. So actually he was working for magazines and then reprinting it in his own books. And then you see, going through the rooms, all the 3 aspects of his works: fashion photography, nude photography, and of course portrait photography, all in one order. It's not a chronological order. Sometimes it's more or less chronological, but sometimes you see photographs from the 70s and the 80s together, and then you have a section of the portraits. You see always the double page spread out onto the wall, and if you see just one page here on the wall, the other side was just blank. So you have this kind of white room within the publication, and here we have an empty spot besides the single work at the book. Yeah, we see his work commissioned by the magazines. He did for himself. But normally he did this kind of commissioned work. We go into it, we see this very risky photographs he did with dolls, with store dummies, for example, and then just dressed up with Yves Saint Laurent or Lavant. Then we see portraits of Andy Warhol or Valentino or Brassai, Lagerfeld. Turning around, you see much more fashion photography from interiors, exteriors, black and white and color side by side. So this is very similar to the book, of course. The book is the core of the exhibition, but you decide how long you stay in front of that. As we were observing the visitors within the exhibition, it was great to see how they read the exhibition, how they read photography without words. Picture says more than 1,000 words, as we say. So this, you see here 400 photographs. This says more than 400,000 words. You see the saddle, for example. This is a very provocative work realized for Vogue Homme in the mid-70s. And several other pictures, nudity, sometimes commissioned for clients like Montblanc. But you see this nudity, which later on used this photograph for the cover of the news magazine Spiegel, and so on. So we go into his work, we go into his ideas, into his head, more or less. And as we know, he came to the shooting, he came to the set with actually an idea which was done. And then just realizing this idea, which he formerly thought of with the models at the shooting, at the set. So this was very unusual comparing with other photographers who were reacting on different sceneries, the surrounding, and so on. So he was doing it with a model, putting everything out of the model, which you can see as well within the films June Newton took of his husband during the shootings. Newton, of course, is famous for his nude female models. But if you look very carefully to this exhibition, a male nude too, Helmut Berger, who was photographed by him dressed and naked. So this is interesting too. You have it very close to the first nude he ever did. This was the Charlotte Rampling one in Arles in 1973. And then you have very close to it Helmut Berger photographed in Beverly Hills. It's interesting that he was not only photographing himself naked as a male nude, but as well this gentleman by then. We have several vitrines in this exhibition, not only for the three boys from Pasadena, but as well here. And there you see the book, the smaller book, which was later done, and two brochures with texts by June Newton and Philip Garner. If you go along, then you see as well some other portraits and couple portraits, and the famous one of Le Pen with the dogs, which was a kind of a remake of Hitler with his dog. Of course, a kind of a naughty approach to this right-wing politician that Helmut Newton, as a Jew, was doing it for New Yorker magazine later on. So here you see in this kind of little tiny corridor in front of the video room, a lot of portraits, including the one of Benedict Taschen, who was the publisher of that book and did a lot of books with Helmut. And this was the first one, the biggest one. And then later on there was the catalog for his retrospective. So you see Anita Ekberg, you see Zaha Hadid, John Huston from the US. So Newton was photographing a lot of people for the magazines, commissioned by the magazines, both in the US and in Europe. So from 1981 onwards, he lived in Monte Carlo, but he spent some months every year at the Chateau Marmont in Los Angeles. He was working as well with some people there. Actually, June said this was just holidays they spent, but they, of course, on the other side, they worked a lot for the magazines, even in California. And if you go into the back room, then you see some more of the big nudes, which is now in the smaller size. Thinking about sizes in photography is quite interesting because Helmut decided to print his works even life-size or even bigger. So this is quite interesting because this book is also big and bold. Yeah, this is very interesting to decide and judge for yourself what is the perfect size of a photograph. Of course, we can reproduce with a photographic negative the image in different sizes. But now we have this size in front of us. This was the given size of the book, 50 by 70 centimeters. And of course, we have it on the page in the size the picture was shot, meaning either it was a 6 by 6 centimeter negative, so you have a square format picture, or it was a 35 millimeter picture, which is a small negative. And then you have a rectangle image in a way. He used both cameras and both systems, but never touched a digital camera, by the way. He was doing analog photography all over his life. In the very early years, he had his own darkroom in Australia, and he was working in a darkroom at Eva Studio as he had this kind of apprenticeship. But later on, he was just working with labs, giving all these films to the labs and then getting back enlargements of the photographs. But he was very picky with good enlargements for his printed work for the work he was giving into the art market. We see the printed page of the book, and it's a very, very good quality. He was looking for that very carefully, that his motifs were printed in the most perfect way. You see here at the last room, at the very last room actually, the latest work he realized for magazines, even for Playboy magazine and for Vanity Fair, New Yorker, Interview magazine, and so on. If you compare that with the earlier ones, he developed his style in the 60s and 70s, just following up this style, regardless if he was hired by Playboy or French Vogue. We have never displayed so many pictures like now, like this time, with the Sumo, Three Boys from Pasadena, within June's room, the private collection of Helmut and June. There were more than 600 works on the wall. We are entering now June's room, and we see a famous self-portrait Helmut took into a mirror. This is as you would be photographed by him. He's looking into the mirror. He is looking at June from behind and into the face. He's behind the camera, so he becomes one with the camera in a way. And you see in the back the television and some paintings on the wall. And this kind of idea, let's say the kickstart for the exhibition in June's room. The photograph, the self-portrait and portrait of June was taken in New York in a hotel room in the early 70s. If you go around the corner into June's room, you see their collection. And there are a lot of great photographers. So we brought these photographs from the apartment in Monte Carlo some time ago to the foundation, and is now part of the foundation's collection. We're showing this for the first time in public. On the one hand, you have a lot of nudes by other great photographers. You have some portraits. We start with Robert Mapplethorpe, Man Ray, and then an anonymous photography. Brassai, we have Bill Brandt, we have Cartier-Bresson, we have Hans Bellmer, Horst P. Horst. We have the famous photograph of Marilyn Monroe for Playboy magazine. The very early ones. We have Hühner, Gibson, and a lot of more. A great collection, which shows us a little bit about the taste of Helmut and June. And these photographs were, until his death, in their apartment in Monte Carlo. There's a very famous photograph of Everton, another Horst P. Horst. Some other are anonymous. This becomes full circle in a way that June gave us these photographs, this collection into the foundation Helmut founded in 2003 in his hometown, Berlin. On the big wall, you see a portrait of Sieff, of the couple. Around the corner, another portrait of Helmut Newton, shot by Everton and by Penn. And there's August Sander, and on one of the walls, Helmut Newton in the center, with shot by Penn, shows on one side America, on the other side Germany, with Sander and Salomon. So he's more or less in between this situation. And there's a lot of Paris photographs. So it's more or less his life shown here through his collection. So this is the end of our virtual tour through the exhibitions, and I would be very happy to welcome you here at the Helmut Newton Foundation in the future.